1.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Challenges with Fast Enrolling Post-Operative Acute Pain Studies, presented by Roe. I'm Ricardo Castaño, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Becky Baggett, Senior Project Manager at Roe, Marina Acosta-Enslin, Clinical Team Lead for Roe, and Ben Vaughn, Principal Statistical Scientist at Roe. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Profile button on the bottom of your screen. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Becky, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Rick. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're so glad to have you with us today. Posted here, you can see the agenda for what we plan to cover today. Obviously, there's so much more to cover with this topic. We'll do the best we can to get through the major challenges and mitigations and topics, but obviously we'll have some questions at the end. So please do feel free to send those on through. Okay, so what are we talking about here when we say post-operative acute pain models? The ones that are listed here are the most common, and they all are a little different. So the top two, bunionectomy and abdominoplasty, will be your faster enrolling post-operative acute pain studies. Hernia repair is another common one, and then ones like total knee replacement, those are going to be a little bit slower enrolling, but also a common model that is used. We list here the third molar extraction, which is a model that is used, but typically this is more of a proof of concept model and not used for your pivotal phase 3.
So our big goal here is to get products approved. And for pain products, they're going to be going to DAAP. This division is frequently overloaded. They often miss the due dates. So making sure that you have efficient and clear communication is key for getting the protocols aligned with their expectations. What you don't want is to have an interaction and get your meeting minutes and come back and realize that something you needed to have clarified did not get resolved coming out of there. Particularly for your pivotal studies, these come on fast and very quickly. The SAP pretty much needs to be in the protocol in terms of your primary efficacy analyses, and you really want to leave your end of phase 2 meeting with no questions outstanding. In other indications, you can use recent approvals to inform what the expectations are. Unfortunately, this division has not had that many recent approvals, so you can't go back through the reviews and see what the agency's current thinking is.
So when we talk about fast enrolling studies, I know everyone has their own perspective of what that means. So what we are talking about here at Roe, when we say fast, these are the metrics that we are referring to. So as I mentioned, your enrollment will vary depending on the model that you use. So the middle bullet there, you'll see average rate on a recent study. So these are the more of the bunionectomy and the abdominoplasty. You'll see anywhere from 6 to 8 subjects per site per week as an average. There are some, sites that have run these studies very frequently. They know how to recruit very well, and you may see up to 14 subjects at these sites for each week. So it is a lot of enrollment, very quickly moving, and the impact most directly or most immediately is the monitoring. And when we talk about fast-paced enrollment, it goes hand in hand with fast-paced monitoring. And so resourcing is pretty critical to plan from the very beginning. In these studies, we are often seeing CRAs on site 3 days a week, every week. And we are often having to have co-monitors accompany those CRAs just to keep up with the rate of data that is coming through review of casebooks. So it's pretty intense monitoring, and this frequency needs to be discussed with your sites. The planning of how often and how many people will be on site should be discussed up front with everyone involved, and so there's lots of implications. Your sites need to know that so that they can schedule appropriately and have the space for those monitors, have the staff that can interact with those monitors. But also, when you look at your budget, do you have enough budget for these visits, for the amount of visits and the intensity of those visits, which relates to the resources that you're adding to your study? So a few different perspectives there. There are a lot of challenges to consider, and by all means, this is not an exhaustive list. But these are sort of the more critical ones that we were thinking of when we were developing this presentation. So for these types of studies, depending on the model, each surgeon has their own techniques and surgical protocols that they're used to following. In the sites that have their own surgeons will obviously know this information, and they're a great resource to reach out to when you're planning your study to determine what is the surgical protocol or what techniques do their surgeons use for this particular model. Another thing to consider is the anesthesia that will be used. Obviously, with the pain studies, your endpoints are all related to the pain, and therefore you don't want to use anesthesia protocols that will have long-lasting anesthesia that will impact your endpoints. So make sure you're discussing the anesthesia regimen that the anesthesiologist will be planning to use to determine what the impact on your study will be. As we discussed with the monitoring, it really does leave very little time for your CRAs to have impact that can provide guidance or retraining when they arrive on site. Once the first subjects are enrolled, if you're enrolling 14 subjects in a week, by the time the monitor shows up on site, there's already maybe 14 or more casebooks waiting for their review, which is a lot to get through, particularly for the very first visit. So that presents a really big challenge. And then from the site's perspective, maintaining the pace of the data collection and the EDC entry. So talking to your sites about resourcing to make sure that they can keep pace with the data entry. You're going to want to see that data as in real time as possible. So setting some expectations about data entry, query resolution with those sites up front is really important. But not only that, you want to make sure that they are doing this quickly, but of quality. So do they have a quality system in place to support this fast-paced data entry and also the resources that are required to support that quality system? So how do we mitigate these challenges? There are a few things that we will touch on in the subsequent slides, starting with a very specific and well-written protocol. It is really beneficial to make sure you're taking your time, you're getting a lot of buy-in from key opinion leaders, from the folks that we've already discussed, your surgeons, your anesthesiologists, your sites, to make sure that operationally your protocol is easy to follow. We want to make sure that there's nothing overcomplicated, everything is very clear, so that the sites know exactly what they're doing at all times. The upfront planning, we cannot stress this enough. There's so many pieces that go into this. It's not just how do I get my site up and running and my first patient in as quick as possible. There are so many pieces that you really need in a fast-paced study to have in place so that once enrollment goes, you don't have to be making too many adjustments or that you have too many things that are coming up timeline-wise that are impacting your enrollment. So with regards to the well-written protocols, as I mentioned, you're going to want to make sure that they are reviewed by multiple key roles that will be participating in this study, as well as obviously within your own organization, just to make sure that it is accomplishing the goals you've set forth for this development plan.
Another great resource is the FDA's website, Drugs at FDA, first for looking at labels, but also looking at the medical, statistical, and other reviews of these products. It's very informative. Unfortunately, there aren't any recent approvals to draw on, but a CRO that is active in this field should be aware of the current agency thinking via consistent themes in the IND meetings, pre-IND meetings, pre-NDA, and the phase 2. The questions and requests and things that the agency is asking for there can be very informative. This can also even be in information requests, following submissions, even in submissions that end in a complete response letter. There's a lot of information that can be gleaned from those interactions with the agency, and all of this is informative in designing a protocol and endpoints. Input also collected from key opinion leaders, sites, and general CRO experience can be very helpful in putting together that protocol.
In terms of upfront planning, one of the most critical things that you can do is to implement a quality management system and have that in place, a quality management system that's in compliance or follows the E6R2 guidance from ICH. As part of that quality management system, you're going to be taking some time to identify your critical data points and your critical processes, and this will really help you to look at your program, look at your study, and identify what really matters and what data is important and critical for the submission. Because as Ben mentioned before, part of the goal here is to get the submission successfully submitted and approved the FDA. So this starts in the whole planning phase before the protocol is even finalized. Once you've identified those critical data points, those processes, you then want to do an analysis and then identify any risks that you might encounter to those critical data points or to those processes that could be an impediment to a successful project. Once you identify those risks, you will be able to evaluate those. You might be able to eliminate some through some fine-tuning of the protocol, which is why it's really important that this step is implemented before you finalize your protocol. Any risk that can be eliminated just by making a change to your protocol before finalization is certainly helpful. And then there are some risks that we really can't eliminate, but you can manage those risks. If you complete these steps in the planning phase, then you can put a process in place or some active controls in place. So as you identify these risks as the study is ongoing, you can manage them appropriately. By setting quality tolerance limits and thresholds for actions, you already have those actions defined before you see the risk. And of course, part of the E6R2 guidance is that this process is not just done once, it's iterative, it's a cycle. So you're going to want to set an advanced plan. How frequently do you want to reassess and relook at your risks and follow that timeline? New risks will certainly appear, things that you did not anticipate, and there may be risks that you did anticipate that perhaps were not as critical as you thought that they might be, or they did not occur as you had anticipated. So having that quality management system in place at the planning stage is really important to success of really any protocol, and it's what ICH is expecting these days. Applying your appropriate mitigations based on the outcome of your risk and analysis and having those plans in place will be very important. And then, of course, using any lessons learned from previous protocols. If you're working with a CRO that has a big footprint in acute pain space, they, I'm certain, have lessons learned from previous protocols. So you want to, just like in terms of looking for your protocol, when you're writing a protocol, you want to get informed information from your CRO, from other experts, and from KOL. In terms of data collection, as I already mentioned, it's really important to identify what is critical. What is the critical data that you're looking for? And once that's identified through that kind of quality management system that you're putting in place, then it will be easy for you to identify what truly needs to be captured in the CRF. If you recall, these studies are enrolling fast. Sites, they might have resources that are working on managing their subjects, seeing subjects, they're not going to have a lot of time for data entry. So you want to ensure that everything the site is entering is truly meaningful and that you do need it and you will be using that data. Along with that, having a straightforward and efficient EDC design is really important. You want your site staff to be able to understand what they're putting in, why they're entering it in EDC. You want the system to be as user-friendly as possible for them. Sites get frustrated very quickly if they're using a system that is hard to navigate or hard to enter. And along with that, some comprehensive completion guidelines. That way, if a site is in a situation or a site staff member and they're entering data and they're not quite sure how to enter it, or there might be some sort of convention that needs to go along, if they have those comprehensive completion guidelines, they're going to be entering the data the way that you expect to see it. And that will really cut down on some of the cleaning that needs to be done, some of the queries that might need to be issued. With this particular type of study, you're not going to have a lot of time to go back and make corrections. So you don't want data on a high number of subjects to be entered incorrectly and then sites be asked to go back and re-enter that data. They don't have time to make those corrections. They frequently get frustrated if you're changing your strategy or asking them to re-enter something. When designing your edit checks, again, you want to go back to that question of what matters. So write impactful edit checks. Put those impactful edit checks in place in your system. And then it's also important to decide up front in the planning stage on the format and method of metrics reporting as early as possible. And as Ben has mentioned, it's important to get that cross-functional buy-in, and I'm going to actually pass things over to Ben to add to that point.
So at the point that we're going to submission to FDA, there are some conformance checks that we have to do on the data, and some of these checks are not necessarily things that you would think about from a clinical perspective or a study conduct perspective, but they are very critical in terms of having a good score for your compliance with SDTM and ADAM guidelines. So making sure that you get that cross-functional buy-in, what's important to the statisticians, what's important to the programmers, and the people in charge of data standards to make sure that your submission does look good and meets the criteria that FDA has made mandatory.
So some further considerations regarding the data collection. As we mentioned, because enrollment is so fast-paced, because your monitors will be getting used to the site source with that first IMV or even the second IMV, trying to navigate their way through those case books, they are looking at maybe a single or two subjects in that visit. So central review of data becomes pretty critical with fast-paced studies. And again, this goes back to making sure that the data is entered in a timely manner, and allowing that to happen does for all the things that Marina mentioned with a simple design, with limited but impactful edit checks, so it's not getting in the way of that data entry. But you want to make sure that you are using data systems that will best facilitate getting the data out. So in your EDC system, how easy is it for you to pull out the data and then be able to review it in a centralized either platform, or if you have your own proprietary system or your programmers, how quickly can you get that data? Does it come out in a format that's usable so that you can quickly look in an aggregate view of your data that's coming in? This is critical to help your CRAs while they're on site so that you can look for trends and make corrections in real time so that those data issues do not perpetuate through the remainder of your subjects. You know, the operational simplicity is also very important. One great example I can think of is people love dynamic forms in an EDC system, but unfortunately dynamic forms rely on clean data to present the next CRF. And when data entry errors happen, it can be very confusing for a site to tell them, well, actually, okay, you need to go delete this piece of data or correct this piece of data in order to get the CRF that I'm really asking you to enter. Try to think about those design elements as you are designing your CRF in your EDC system.
So with longer running studies, it's, the flow is frequently, you'll have the protocol, you'll start collecting data, the SAP will be developed, and adjustments can be made based on what you're seeing in the data. With a fast enrolling study like this, you really do not have that opportunity. The SAP should be developed in parallel with the protocol, and you really should anticipate everything possible. The other piece of this is that this division is very particular about primary efficacy analyses and having those fully specified in the protocol, particularly with respect to missing data. And so making sure that any questions that you have about that primary analysis and how it will be handled in our data handling are discussed at the end of phase 2 meeting. It is very difficult to get a specific final answer from this division and the agency in general, but you can certainly know when you're kind of going out of bounds. So making sure that you get everything nailed down that you can and discussing that with the agency at the end of phase 2 for a pivotal study is critical. One major topic that we've seen a lot of discussion around in this therapeutic area is opioid sparing. As of right now, in order to have an opioid sparing claim, you have to show both that less opioids were used and that you have fewer opioid-related AEs. However, this could be changing. Given the extent of the opioid crisis, there is a possibility that the agency will start looking at other outcomes and make sure that this is something that you discuss with the agency if you plan to have an opioid-sparing outcome. It's possible that something like no use of opioids while in clinic or no opioids issued when they're leaving the clinic could be potential outcomes in the future, since there's a change in thought that perhaps that opioid sparing in of itself could be an outcome. But as of right now, you are looking for those opioid-related AEs. If you are going to seek an outcome on that, you will need a much larger sample size simply because not everybody is going to use opioids, so that cuts down the number of subjects that are exposed, and then not everyone will develop an AE as a result. So it takes a much, much larger trial to truly be powered for the agency's current expectations for opioid sparing.
So with regards to responsibilities and communication pathways, a lot of this may seem very elementary, but it becomes very critical once your enrollment starts and once the work begins on site. You need to make sure you are discussing ahead of time who is responsible for what. And when it's within the same functional area, that is much easier. It's for those things that go cross-functional that it starts to get a little confusing. So ask your team, ask yourself, who will handle site questions, PI questions? If they're medical in nature, maybe they go to the medical monitor. But then who will be circling back to provide that response? CRA questions. These can range from medical questions to how do you enter data. Who is going to handle those questions? Obviously, throughout the trial, you try to maintain a frequently asked questions log. Much of this comes at the beginning of the investigator meeting, and then you add to it as your study goes along. But this needs to be updated on a very frequent and regular basis and then disseminated to the sites quickly. So who will be in charge of making those updates? Will there be a QC process? Who's going to be in charge of that? And then so on and so forth. Who's going to send it to the sites? Where will it be posted, or is it going to go through email? So all of these seemingly tiny details are important when time is very short. Data issues, obviously, a lot of people want to review data issues. It's truly a cross-functional discussion. However, does it have to include everyone cross-functionally? So thinking about being able to streamline those conversations so that decisions can be made quickly and then sent to the site so that they can have those updates as they are entering the data. What are your escalation pathways? Make sure that you are clearly defining who the escalation point is within your study team. And what is the turnaround expected for escalations? And do your CRAs know that? So all of these things that not only do you need to decide, you need to also communicate, document in a plan so that everyone can have access to it and understand the expectations. What is your CAPA process? Make sure everyone is trained on that. Does it fit in with your risk-based monitoring approach? So all of these things, make sure that they are clearly documented in a plan, especially if you're going to have new people joining at a later time, but also clearly communicated to the team. Something else that I know Marina has touched on with the metrics, but this becomes really important not only for communicating externally, but also internally. So if you are having data review meetings or quality review meetings, what are those key performance indicators, and what format, what reports are you looking at? Make sure that everyone on your team has access and training on those reports, so that when you do have these meetings, everyone is speaking the same language, and you're not spending half the time just trying to figure out what exactly you're looking at.
In terms of monitoring, one thing that may want to be considered is the use of a risk-based quality monitoring system. Frequently that term is called risk-based monitoring, and it utilizes different types of monitoring other than the direct on-site monitoring, such as centralized monitoring or the use of a targeted or reduced SDV. If you're following using centralized monitoring, then that really allows you to look at the data frequently in more real time to identify if there are any outliers, if there are any issues, if there are any trends. If you are using and implementing a full quality management, risk management system, then you're probably going to have KRIs set, and using a centralized monitoring system will allow you to identify when you're meeting those thresholds in terms of the KRIs. We talked earlier about having systems in place. So if you have a system that allows you to pull fancy reports and look at that information, you can do that. You can also employ centralized monitoring simply by doing a simple listing review and looking at the critical data that you're really interested in. If you do a targeted or reduced SDV approach, this will allow you to get through the monitoring portion of your study and keep in pace with the enrollment for your study. So usually centralized monitoring and reduced SDV or targeted SDV go hand in hand. So it's certainly a consideration to make. It will decrease the resources that are needed for monitoring because you'll have fewer on-site visits, or at least you'll need fewer days overall on site. That said, you're still probably going to need weekly monitoring visits with studies that are enrolling this fast. If you wait to put those in place until after enrollment is over or enrollment has already been met, you're going to discover that you have a very large backlog in terms of your data review. So one thing that we advise is to tentatively schedule those monitoring visits in advance, work proactively with the sites, and go ahead and schedule those during the SIV. Get on the schedule. In terms of the first visit that occurs at every site, one thing that's going to be really important in a fast enrolling study, because there's so little time for correction, is you want to ensure that those first subjects that are randomized have been screened appropriately, have been randomized appropriately, and that the site is appropriately following the protocol. In order to do that, you need to have a monitor on site to review the data and to look at the sources and the cases as soon as possible. So scheduling that first visit at the time of the SIV is a great idea. Usually these sites are pretty proactive about pre-screening and screening activities. So typically at the SIV, they already have a good idea in mind when their first screening visits are scheduled and when their first randomizations will occur. So it shouldn't be too difficult for a CRA to go ahead and get on the schedule at that time point. Also very important is ensuring that you have enough CRA resource in place up front. You don't want to get into a situation where there's a large data backlog and you're scrambling to try and find resources to monitor the data. And proactively plan for co-monitoring. That expect it to occur. As Becky had mentioned earlier, we anticipate that CRAs will probably need to be on site 2 to 3 days each week in order to keep up with the backlog for some of these fast enrolling studies.
So timelines, everybody's favorite topic. All of this planning really helps you with developing your timelines. You're going to need to know what you're facing in terms of your startup activities, what you're putting in your plan, obviously your enrollment rate, what resourcing you're going to need. But with all of that, you need to make sure you're keeping an eye on your critical path items. So one thing to consider is what are the turnaround times for the vendors or for those items that need to be developed for your protocol? How long does it take to build your EDC system? Your central lab vendor, what is their turnaround time for contracts? All of these things are your critical path that will let you know what is reasonable for your first patient, first visit. And then all of your subsequent milestones and your timelines will be able to be determined based on the planning you've done with the monitoring, and if you're able to keep up with all of those items, you will hit those milestones more regularly than having to worry about any delay with data review or delayed data entry. So making sure that you are doing the upfront planning, because it really will help with keeping your timelines intact. Some things to consider as well: statistical programming. This can take some time, and usually programmers like to do this on live data because it shows what they will be working through in terms of any data issues. If it's possible, maybe think about some other options. Could you do programming on UAT data? If your vendor requires a test transfer, could that test transfer be used so that the programmer gets an idea of the structure of the data so that they can begin at least providing specifications for their programs? Make sure that you are considering all of the data sources and what the turnaround times are for extracting that data, applying data corrections, and then subsequent data exports. What are the turnaround times for those? And make sure that those are incorporated with your data review meetings that you're having, as well as your statistical deliverables. So a couple things to consider in terms of your timelines. We're not just speaking to the milestones that you'll accomplish, but what time of year are you conducting your study? So one thing that can come up on acute pain studies is if you are planning a study that will span across daylight savings time, this obviously becomes very critical when you're talking about data being collected at specific time points. So there are oftentimes sites that will have patients stay over the weekend, and daylight savings time occurs on the early hours of Sunday morning. So where are your sites located? Do they observe daylight savings time? I mean, really the best thing is to avoid it altogether if you can. But if you cannot, make sure that you're planning for that and you're discussing with the sites what their plan is in order to make sure that they are collecting the time points at the accurate time needed for the protocol. So we touched on vendor management a little bit, but really, as early as you can have these discussions with the vendors, the better. Asking them for their turnaround times for the contract negotiations. Also, things like initial supply to the site. So Central Lab is a very typical vendor used in these studies. So it would be a great idea to ask your Central Lab vendor, what is your initial startup timeline? When can my sites receive their lab kits? What steps are there that need to be accomplished in order to reach that time point? And then also, once study begins, what is your resupply timeline? So for these studies that are seeing maybe up to 14 subjects supplying lab kits is 10 business days, 15 business days, it's really not going to work in order to keep those sites supplied adequately for the trial. So maybe think about, do we oversupply the sites in the beginning so that they have a surplus, and then they can time their resupply requests in a way that they don't run out of supplies? And then what is your contingency plan in case that actually does happen? How will they handle that? Another thing to consider is if you can keep all services under the same umbrella, that does work best in order to keep communication as well as just sort of the overall quality of the data as well as the operations of the trial. It allows the functional areas, and we're mostly speaking about the main ones, data management, clinical operations, biostatistics, project management. Obviously there's others, but these groups often work very close together during these trials to make sure that they are discussing any data issues that come up quickly, any issues that come up at the site that need to be escalated. But another benefit to this is that the teams are very familiar with the systems that are being used. So your CRAs are familiar with the EDC system that your data management group can build. They're familiar with the reports, and they know how to get the data out of the system easily. And that takes a lot of the learning curve out of the equation when you're trying to keep up with the enrollment and also with the data cleaning processes. So speaking of enrollment, everybody likes to talk about enrollment. It's always a hot topic. In these studies, it's not as much of a problem in terms of how am I going to enroll my study in time. It's more of how am I going to control that enrollment a little bit. So you want to make sure that when you're talking with your sites, that they have the therapeutic experience. I know that is a pretty obvious one, but also the resourcing. So we talked about this a little bit. Make sure they have the adequate staff, not only for conducting the protocol assessments, if they're going to be keeping subjects over the weekend, do they have staff? Do they have night staff if that's needed? Do they have data entry staff? And then most important, do they have quality management staff that will oversee their operations as well? Consider whether they have any competing trials. You can ask that question. Ask them how many studies they are currently running. What is their projection of how many studies they'll be running when your study is running? And if they do have competing trials, what is their plan? Also, what is their capacity? So how many surgery days do they have a week? How many surgeries of your particular model can they perform in a day? How many beds do they have at their facility? All of these things will help you determine what the enrollment rate will be at that site for your study. Something also to consider is because we know that the enrollment and the data collection will go so very quickly, maybe slow roll the enrollment for the very first couple of subjects. And what I mean by that is have the sites enroll 2 subjects and then have a monitor go and review data, discuss with the site how it went, and then also if there's any correction that needs to be made or retraining, questions that come up, all of that can be sort of kept at a very small volume so that the issues do not perpetuate through the remainder of the subjects. This is very easy to achieve if you plan for it ahead. Sites don't have to stop enrollment. They can actually schedule their surgery so that they're having, a couple during that first week, and then schedule the remainder of what they fully plan to enroll moving forward. And it actually helps a lot to be able to step in, take a breather, ensure quality, and make sure that the sites get their questions answered as well.
So as we've mentioned a couple times now, it's really important to remember that there is limited time to correct issues when you have studies that are enrolling at such a fast pace. Due to that, it's really important that sites are very well trained and that the sites that you select are qualified to conduct the study. Frequently, once a trend is identified, enrollment could be close to over, so we want to try and mitigate any trends from occurring to begin with. Kind of hand in hand with that, and Becky alluded to this as well, is that there's a learning curve for CRAs at new sites. So sites who are familiar to CRAs who are familiar with sites, or CROs that are familiar with using sites, if you go to those sites, then we've worked with them before. The CRAs know how their source works. We know what their processes are. We know what their staffing model is, et cetera. So sometimes that can help you cut down on some of the issues that you might encounter. The sites that you qualify should have a lot of standard procedures around their surgical procedures, the rating procedures, the informed consent procedures. So it is important that you identify the fact that they do have standard procedures in place at their sites. I don't recommend trying to put other standard procedures on top of those that maybe are your own standard procedures, as long as their procedures are adequate. So taking a look at those procedures prior to the SIV or at the SIV, just to confirm that there are no process gaps. Of course, if there are gaps in there based on what the protocol is demanding and you need to implement some sort of extra processing in parallel to theirs, then you would want to do that. But if their processes and procedures that they have in place meet the qualifications, then you want to allow the sites to use their own procedures. In terms of the resourcing demands at the site, recommend asking them to provide you with a resourcing plan. It's important that they understand the demands on their resourcing and on their staff. There are frequently rapid data entry expectations. We need to see that data quickly. Overnight visits could be a possibility, assessments occurring overnight, randomization at 3 o'clock in the morning, for example. So we want to ensure that the site has adequate resources in place and that they fully understand the demands on their staff. Also important along those lines is to provide clear instruction regarding the expected qualifications and certifications for their site staff, and providing that in advance during that planning stage before the SIV, so that you don't have somebody conducting a procedure that may not be qualified to conduct that procedure. You want to ensure that all of the staff working on your study are qualified to do so and qualified to be doing whatever piece it is that they are doing. Along with that, providing clear instructions to sites regarding the documentation of those qualifications and or certifications up front. Again, you don't want to be several months down the line or reviewing the data and reviewing their binder and discover that, 2 staff members that had completed some really important procedures on your study have now left and their training certifications were never appropriately documented. So setting those expectations in place and making sure that everything is in place and that they're very clear at the SIV is very important. And then it's just important to remember that the majority of critical data collection does happen within a very short period of time in terms of the subject involvement. They don't have a lot of follow-up visits. They're not coming in every 2 to 4 weeks like you might see in longer studies. So it's really important to ensure that the site knows what it is that they need to capture and what needs to be present in their source up front and at the beginning of the study as soon as they start seeing subjects.
And our final topic today is the importance of rater training, particularly in these short-term studies. In long-running chronic pain studies, there's more opportunity to retrain and identify trends and issues. If you see one site that has a much lower pain level on average for the subjects than another one, perhaps there are issues in understanding the scales that are being used. With pain outcomes, these are subjective scales, and that lends itself to variability. And variability is the enemy of small significant p-values. So the statisticians really want to take out that variability where possible and where it's noise and not real variability. So rater training is critical. This is both in neutral expectations, but also that the subjects that are reporting their pain do that accurately, and it reflects what the scales should be showing. You want to make sure that your site staff doesn't suggest to patients, well, do you really mean this, or you're not in any pain, are you? That kind of delivery. You want to make sure that it's neutral delivery. And there are vendors that have training modules for this and can participate in the investigator meeting for that type of rater training to make sure that you do it up front, and also that you return to it if you're seeing a site that is having trouble with this. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in today, and we will hand it back over to the moderator for any questions.
All right. So yeah, let's move on to the Q&A. There is still time to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We have lots of great questions already, and we will try to get to as many as possible. So the first one we have here is, how do you handle a study that ends enrollment early, and how does that impact timelines?
Thanks, Greg. This is Becky. I can take that one. So with these studies, they are fast-paced enrolling. There are times that you become surprised that it actually enrolls even faster than you thought. So some of the downstream effects with that are a lot of the things that we talked about trying to prevent from the beginning, with the SCV review and making sure that you're not having a backlog at the site. But something that you may not have considered is resourcing. So, if all of a sudden all of the items in your timeline are starting to now overlap directly, whereas you had them staggered, what you have to think about is there might be some resources that you had intended to also stagger, which now you need to supplement and add resources so that multiple activities can be going on all at the same time. This is especially true if you're running multiple studies at the same time. So a lot of times the plan is to stagger your studies so that the same resources can be used across those or more protocols. But in reality, one then all of a sudden is on top of the other, and now you have to train more staff and add more staff. So just having a plan up front for that as part of your risk assessment and what you'll do and how you can quickly train and get those other resources on board.
All right, thank you. So our next question here, how do you determine if a site will be able to sufficiently enroll your study if they're running other competitive studies?
So thank you. This is Becky again. We touched on this a little bit. It is always very important to make sure that you are asking questions of the site during the qualification and feasibility stage. How many competing trials they are running currently, and then providing them with the time frame that you anticipate your study will enroll and what they have planned. Sites are a wealth of information in terms of the competitive landscape, so make sure that you're asking all of those great questions. If you do find that a site will have multiple trials or similar trials at the site, you'll need to determine whether or not you feel comfortable having that site run your trial as well. But you can always ask them for their plan. Sites, this is not unusual for them. They do multiple studies, and they do multiple similar studies. And they most often have a plan in how they will handle that and how they will enroll those studies. So make sure that you're talking with them thoroughly and candidly about that. And then, obviously you need to make that decision for yourself about whether what you're hearing makes you feel comfortable, but don't be afraid to ask those questions.
All right, good to know. So let's see, our next question, and again, feel free if anybody does have any questions to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. The next question is, how would you determine how many to enroll on a staggered basis with your experience?
It's a great question, and I think this is related to the topic where we talked about having two subjects enroll initially and then maybe take a look. You know, again, a lot goes into this. So what are your corporate goals, and will this staggered approach fit in with those corporate goals? I can tell you a lot of these experienced sites, they do it already. So talk to them about it. You know, is this part of their quality management plan? Do they also, you know, and maybe have two surgeries in 1 week and then they review their processes? If that's already part of their processes, then it makes it a little bit easier, you know, for you to incorporate that in your processes. But you definitely, again, want to be having these conversations during the qualification and feasibility stage so that you can incorporate that timing in your timeline overall and message that within your organization about, okay, this is the plan, and we really feel it's important not only for a quality standpoint, but also because the sites are going to do it anyway, so we just need to plan for it.
All right. Okay, one more here. Let's see. Do you recommend using ePro to capture outcomes?
Recommend using ePro, is that the question?
Yes. The question is, do you recommend using ePro to capture outcomes?
Okay, thank you. So, you know, in the acute pain studies, they go so quickly. You know, the subjects are at the site for 2-3 days consecutively. You know, the amount of startup time that it takes for an ePro system to be put in place, and a lot of money and resources that go into UAT planning, I don't know that it's completely worth it to do that full ePro system. Paper seems to work very well, especially since everything is well contained at the site. You know, when you start talking about subject diaries that they are leaving with, that might, you know, lend to considering ePro. So you need to think about the design of your study, the outcomes you're collecting, and how much control you have over those, you know, while the subject is on site, or if they are taking it away, and how much control you want to put around that as well. But there's definitely, you know, costs and time that you have to weigh in all of that.
Yeah. And another great thing about paper is that it doesn't break. Sometimes sites can have frustration with electronic device. These pain scales are collected at relatively precise and tight time intervals, and you don't want to have a site futzing around with logging in and getting to the patient and making sure they understand how to use the device when you're trying to hit a particular time point. So paper is nice in that. However, if there is a component of like a longer-term follow-up over the month following following discharge, a blended model where you're doing paper in clinic and ePro at home is also perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, if you're planning to do a risk-based monitoring approach where you really want to reduce the amount of on-site visits for the CRA, and you really want to just go in with bare bones in terms of what you're doing for STD, then you might want to consider an ePro device, because that's going to ensure that the data is in the data set immediately. It's there, it's reviewable, you can look at it from a central monitoring perspective. So it just really depends on what your goals are.
All right, thank you. Now, it looks like this will be our last question. We had a lot of great questions today. We couldn't get to them all, but we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. This question asks, how do you evaluate sites for recurrent and analgesic trials?
Great question. So, you know, when we are looking at sites, obviously past performance is a big part of what we look at. And sometimes, you know, there are key opinion leaders that, you know, are going to be part of a trial, so you need to consider whether that is a goal or not. But in terms of if you're just looking at how to evaluate sites, we do look at past performance. And if we don't have any data on past performance, then we go through that full feasibility process where we are talking with the sites about, what they have done, what their historical performance has been, as well as, what their quality, management system is. All of these things that we've talked about throughout the presentation are all things that we ask about during the qualification process. Something else that I find very helpful is if you're able to provide a synopsis to the site and you put it in front of them and ask them, whether they see any operational concerns, that can help you determine their level of experience by listening to, how they would operationalize that protocol. If they can't quite answer that question of how do you operationalize that protocol, they may not have as much experience as they say they do. So just something to consider. It absolutely isn't the only thing I would, weigh in on for evaluating the site, but just one piece to try and vet how much experience they actually have if you don't have that historical relationship with them. But relationships with sites is critical. It's very key. You want to make sure that you are able to have very candid conversations with these sites. You want to be able to make sure they feel they can trust you, that you can trust them, and that only helps for you for your future studies to be able to go back to those sites and call on them, to not only get input on your protocols, but also sort of find out for what your enrollment goals are going to be and whether you'll be able to meet them, because they'll be able to tell you, and you can know that you have that relationship with them and you have that historical information, and you can count on those numbers.
All right, thank you so much for that insight. And again, thank you once again. We did have a lot of good questions, and we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. But thank you so much for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.